Incentivizing Employees. Hopefully a very salient time to deliver such a presentation. With Boris's announcements last night, we're obviously in for a continued difficult period, which invariably affects individuals and therefore their performance at work. I think in this environment as well, to spend half an hour speaking to you about how to bonus incentivize your staff would be pretty churlish. So we focus on other areas this morning and some of the softer areas. An area that, or areas that we often shy away from as business owners, as directors of business, because there's no right or wrong answer, and we need to be accepting of that. But nonetheless, the human element is very, very important. So that's me, my ugly mug, I'm afraid. So my name's Ben Smith, I'm one of the directors here and I'm a portfolio holder. The agenda that we're going to cover off today are firstly some basics, and whilst I don't wish to teach anybody how to suck eggs, I think it's an important and timely reminder as to some of the softer skill sides of managing staff and how to incentivise them. We have in our organisations typically key staff, and we're going to spend some time discussing, particularly for the SME sector, about incentivisation and retention of key employees. Further, we will spend a little bit of time just talking about some other areas of more financial reward incentivization, but I'll come back to it's less relevant in my opinion at this particular juncture. And lastly, we'll come on to some questions and answers, and as Lisa mentioned, if you'd be kind enough to either jot them down on a bit of paper or post them into the chat room so that we can address them at the end, that'd be kind. So, why bother? That's got to be the first question, hasn't it? Why do we bother thinking about our staff and how to incentivise and retain them? Well, it's relatively straightforward. Unmotivated and unengaged staff ordinarily are less productive, they're less efficient, and that invariably has an implication on the performance of the company. Many of our businesses are staff orientated, and therefore if we've got an unmotivated workforce, we struggle to expect that the company will perform to its highest capability. And I think without wishing to dwell on matters too much, it's important to highlight how much we need to understand our staff, and particularly at this juncture with COVID-19 and all of the facets that brings. We obviously, the country was locked down in the early course of the spring. The weather was fine. There was perhaps we will battle this war and it'll be over shortly. People are now tired, they're frustrated, they continue to be concerned, and that invariably affects them as individuals and therefore prospectively their performance at work. And some things that we perhaps need to start thinking about and continue to think about in relation to our staff are concerns about their personal health and well-being, staff being isolated at work or, forgive me, at home, concerns about their family health and well-being, concerns about what the future holds, where you have businesses which include remote workers. There is the risk of lack of social contact with not only friends but also peers that you would ordinarily see at the workplace and have that chat at the coffee machine. There's a physical disconnection between the individuals in the business. What often binds a business together is, while staff may whinge about work, there is nonetheless a camaraderie typically in an office environment where a group of people congregate together. It's a natural human instinct. There's the inability to distinguish between work and home. So those working on the kitchen table, their dining room tables, if they're lucky enough to have a small study or a small office from which they can work, their laptop is always there, their mobile phone is always there. It's staring them in the face, and that is their workplace at this particular time. And lastly, but prospectively by no means least, there's a lower competitive environment. Naturally, as human beings, by and large, we compete with those around us, and where you haven't got that physical presence of people, the communication, the striving to achieve better, then it creates prospectively less efficiency and less performance. Very soft areas to understand, but in my opinion, critically important. There are lots and lots of social models and business models that describe these scenarios. There's Schmidt, Penner, Singer, Alderfer. But the key one and the most established model in all of these is what's called Maslow's. It's been around the longest period of time, and I believe the most relevant. So whilst this isn't a school lesson by any stretch of the imagination, I think it's just worth spending a little bit of time just understanding what Maslow's hierarchies and theories were. Fundamentally, he said that as individuals, we have differing needs and of differing types and of differing levels. And it really works its way up from the bottom of this triangle all the way up to the top. So our first needs are physiological needs, so food, water, warmth, and rest. So very, very basic human needs. The next one is security needs. So we need to feel safe. We need to feel comforted. We don't want to feel threatened. We don't want our future or our families to be threatened. There's then belongingness needs, intimate relationships, well, maybe, but perhaps more relevantly, friends, social contact with people that you don't know, new challenges for you as an individual. There's then esteem needs, so prestige, feeling of accomplishment, you've achieved something. And finally, self-actualization needs, which is achieving one's potential. You've got to where you wanted to be. I think now let's just touch on Maslow versus COVID-19, brings it into context. So safety needs. So one of the second from the bottom, everybody is concerned at home and at work about what the future holds for them. They're concerned about becoming unwell. They're concerned prospectively about going into an office, which may not be, in their eyes, as stringent in terms of COVID policies as it might be. So there are deep concerns with certain groups of people. And we also need to bear in mind that we need to take everybody as an individual and not necessarily as a group. There's belongingness needs. So those who are remote working at the minute are away from their work peer group. Even worse, they're away from their social and friendship groups. And there's prospectively a perception of less support by those more senior in the business and supporting them through difficult times. Esteem needs. There's prospectively less frequent contact with managers for feedback. And self-actualization. There's a lack of competition with your peers. So for many, many individuals at this particular time, and this is why I think that it's worth just examining briefly Maslow's hierarchy, there are a multitude of issues right down at the bottom of the pyramid that needs to prospectively be addressed before we can hope to get the most out of our employees and support them. So some very simple solutions that don't cost any money, but perhaps require a different way for people to address the management of staff with their business. So safety needs, communicate with staff about their working environment, be transparent with them, consult with them and critically listen to their concerns and see whether they can be addressed. Reinforce that their personal safety is a priority for the business. Give them the comfort blanket that they want and need critically in the working environment. Belongingness needs. Hold regular team meetings via Microsoft Teams or like Zoom like we're using this morning, and ensure that each team member is listened to and engaged with. Typical weakness that I see is that team managers have a propensity to talk at staff rather than give the staff the opportunity to discuss their own concerns, discuss their own needs, and feedback upwards. Esteem needs. Ensure staff receive regular feedback, at minimum monthly. At this particular juncture in time, I think perhaps weekly is even more relevant. Just connecting with the staff. And lastly, what we call gamification. It's a strange phrase that, but trying to make work fun. Imagine sitting at the kitchen table, perhaps many of you are doing so yourselves. You're seeing the same four walls each day, you're lacking in contact with other people. See how we can make the work environment fun. To give me a short break, I've got a YouTube video from a guy called Gary Vaynerchuk, whom many of you may have seen before. He's quite verbose in how he presents matters, but perhaps succinctly sets out how important emotional intelligence is with people, which I shall play to you now.
The most important thing for speed, for your company and your service is your internal culture. The number one thing that will make your company go fast is continuity and lack of politics, which means we are on the dawn of the era where emotional intelligence is about to become the single most important trade. That skills through technology growth will continue on a daily basis to be commoditized. But your emotional capabilities to interact with others will become a very, very important trade. I highly recommend. How many people here have a company with more than 10 people? Raise your hand. Take this one thing away from me. You better go home and audit every single employee you have, and you better figure out which employee makes the other employees miserable. I don't give a shit if it's your number one salesperson, your best developer, or your co-founder. Cancer spreads. With cancer and politics comes lack of speed. Your company will get much slower because people are sitting around debating how miserable they are or worried to have meetings with other individuals. Your company will get slow in a world where the speed of product output, features, and how you interact with your customers has never been greater. So I implore a tech-centric, financial-centric, type A room like this to go home and get really in tune with their fucking feelings. In my company, the number 2 person is not the CFO or the CEO, COO, excuse me. The number 2 person after me is Claude Silver. She is the Chief Heart Officer. She's the head of HR, call it what you want. It is no question the biggest variable to our success. It is never, and I mean ever, been more important for you to care about the internal feelings, culture. Let me tell you how you do not build culture. You do not build culture by having free snacks in your cafeteria. Let me tell you how you do not build culture. You do not build culture by having a foosball table or open seating. You build culture by actually talking to people one by one and understanding what they care about. And what you will learn is some people want money, and some people want time with their family, and some people want title, and some people want creativity, and it is your job. How many people are the CEO of their company? It is your job to know every single one of those things about every single person every single day. Because 23-year-old Sally at 27 wants different. 31-year-old Charlie at 34 wants different. It is time that this ecosystem starts paying attention to the human elements that will drive our businesses to the next level. This is a conversation we are not having, and it is the conversation in the next decade. Thank you.
So a colourful character by any stretch of the imagination, but hopefully reinforces the point about the need to understand your staff, understand their specific needs and address them in simple ways. We'll move now on to some of the incentivization programs about retaining key employees. So we're starting to work on the main engine room, which is the main body of the staff, incentivizing them, making sure they're happy, making sure they feel fulfilled. But now we need to ensure that we've got those key staff to continue to drive the business forward. So what are the issues? And this is ordinarily the case, particularly for SME businesses. So the key employee, they're driven, they want to keep working towards the top level of Maslow's hierarchy, which in their mind is prospectively represented by heightened levels of responsibility, heightened financial reward typically, and heightened job satisfaction. On the other side of matters, the SME employer has identified that the individual is key, is long-term, but is potentially and particularly unable to address the short-term financial reward offered by prospectively larger competitors. So in an SME, the individual, say, for example, they may be on £60,000 a year, given their importance to the business, but a comparable job within a larger business may be somewhere in the order of 90 to 100,000. So the key question is, how do we go about aligning these two differences? So the government and the revenue together have facilitated and introduced a number of differing incentivisation programs, principally linked around share schemes to provide to key employees by SMEs. So the key question from your perspective will be, well, why are HMRC involved? The key issue is a horrendous bit of tax legislation called employee-related security legislation. Okay. In English, if you just give an employee some shares in your business and it's not constructed in the correct fashion, then the revenue's view is that employee has only received those shares in your business by virtue of them working there, which is difficult to deny. And therefore, the value of those shares should be subject to income tax and national insurance. So constructed in an incorrect fashion, it can be extremely expensive for both the individual and also the employer, and is very unwelcome. Okay. These schemes tend to be most effective where there is long-term growth prospectively in the business and to align that individual with that long-term growth. There are many, many different schemes available. Okay, so there's share incentive plans, save as you earn, company share option plan, enterprise management incentives, and employee shareholder shares. Those are all HMRC approved schemes, and the last one, which is not approved by HMRC but nonetheless is very common, is what's called growth shares. And the two most popular which we're going to discuss this morning, are indeed employee management incentives and also the growth share scheme. So taking each in turn, so an EMI share option scheme is relevant to SME businesses. The individual must, of course, be an employee, but they're always going to be if they're going to be a key employee. Company assets must be less than 30 million at the date of inception of the scheme, and the company can grant up to the value of £250,000 in any 3-year period. There are certain sector exclusions, including legal and accountancy practices, and there are some others, but broadly speaking, it's available to the majority of trading businesses. So in reality, what happens, and we'll come on to an example to flesh it out in a moment, the company in essence awards an option to the employee to enable them to subscribe for a shareholding in the business at today's value, subject to conditions being met, which can be established by the company in crafting the option scheme. So they're not predetermined and can be linked to share sales, they can be linked to trading performance. The employee can give to the company a letter saying, right, I want to subscribe for these shares now. Critically for the employer, in the event that the individual leaves the business and hasn't subscribed for the shares, they fall away. The option scheme falls away in its entirety, and it's also got an end stop date of 10 years. So if you put in place a scheme in November 2020 and the conditions hadn't been met and the individual hadn't subscribed, the scheme falls away in November 2030. But it's a sufficient time span for longevity for the individual with the business. Income tax is only triggered if the subscription amount is less than the market value. So in English, if the shares are worth 100 grand and he's only paid 50 grand, he or she would pay income tax and national insurance on the £50,000 differential. But critically for them, capital gains tax is paid in the event sale price exceeds the subscription price. So coming back to the example, somebody subscribes at 100,000, sells at 500,000, they'd be taxed at what is now business asset disposal relief, more commonly known as entrepreneurs relief rate of 10%. Far easier really to flesh out with an example. So John is awarded an EMI share option scheme that enables him to subscribe for a 5% shareholding in the trading company for which he works. The market value of the shares at the date of the award is 100,000. So John can subscribe for the shares on the earlier of EBITDA, which is effectively a profit measure, exceeding £1 million for 3 years consecutively. So let's imagine when the scheme was awarded that he was doing 500,000. So there's been a growth and he can therefore now subscribe for the shares, or there is an unconditional sale agreed. So the share capital of the business is going to be sold. So taking this and putting some numbers upon it, in year 4, there is an unconditional offer for sale of the business at £5 million. John subscribes for his 5% and pays to the company £100,000. I'll come on to that in a minute, because not many people have got £100,000 knocking about. And he receives from the sale £250,000. He pays tax at 10% on the gain of 150,000, being 15 grand. John is therefore wealthier by 250,000, less the £100,000 subscription price, less the tax at 15,000. So he is better off as an individual of 100 by £135,000. When we contrast that with the costs to incentivise him through salary increases, then it vastly outweighs what he would have received on a net basis. On the initial subscription of £100,000, there can be what's called a cashless exercise. In English, he'd never have to put the £100,000 in on the sale. He'd just receive the 150, being the net of the 250 and the 100. So don't let that be a debarment to being able to implement the scheme. Growth shares, which are again becoming more and more common, particularly as individual loans to invest in businesses are becoming more and more difficult. So it is not an HMRC approved scheme, so there are no specific conditions to qualify, but it enables the employee to subscribe for shares that enable them to participate in future capital value of the business and also future profits, whilst preserving existing value to existing shareholders. Again, by way of example, so there are 4 existing shareholders: Mike, Rob, Melanie and Georgia. The value of their business is £2 million, but they want to bring John into equity ownership, but he hasn't got the money to buy a stake. So by way of example, 10% of £2 million would cost him £200,000. So what do Mike, Rob, Melanie and Georgia do? Let this guy go or find an alternate way? So what they decide to do, having taken some advice, is reclassify the shares that they own in the business as a different class of shares. It could be A shares, could be B shares. I've called them here founder shares, which gives them the rights to the first £2 million of a resale. So they're preserving their existing capital value and also dividends from historic profits. At that juncture, we also issue new participating shares, I've called them. Again, there could be any designation, and they're issued to Mike, Rob, Melanie, Georgia and John. And the participating shares enable each to share in any capital value uplift beyond 2 million and to enjoy dividends arising from the profits after the date of their issue. So in short, we are preserving the capital value of the business to the founder shareholders, as I've called them here, but we're enabling John to participate on an ongoing basis with Mike, Rob, Melanie and Georgia in whatever proportion that they agree in relation to the future capital value and also dividend receipts. So 2 key share option schemes for long-term retention of staff, firstly being EMI share option schemes, secondly being growth shares. Now, it won't have bypassed any of you that the real merit in EMI share option schemes and growth shares are where there's going to be a long-term increase prospectively in capital value and at the same time contemporaneously tying people into your business. There are alternate methods. I think that they are less relevant at this particular time. The next 6 to 9 months is particularly uncertain for all businesses in all sectors, save if you make face masks. So we won't spend a significant amount of time exploring them, but just to highlight them. So firstly, common approach, bonuses subject to both income tax and national insurance. They can be discretionary or they can be target driven. So discretionary is an award where you particularly recognise the efforts or performance of a particular individual, or indeed they can be target driven. If they're target driven, they firstly need to be stretching but not unachievable, because it can be demotivating in its own right. They do need to be specific, time bound and measurable. So in other words, there is absolute clarity between both employer and employee as to what performance targets they need to meet. It's quite a difficult one in many ways, unless you're in a sales environment, which can be sales driven, is sales driven, but it also ignores lots of other factors: quality behaviour as a team member rather than as an individual. So there are downsides to it. There's also, and prospectively less expensive in some ways, benefits in kind. So firstly, flexible working. However, I would point out, what do I mean by flexible working? Firstly, perhaps working some core hours and having flex either side of the day to fill the necessary amount of hours per week. Secondly, working from home. I think that that's going to become more of an expected norm, particularly after the past 6 months, rather than a perceived benefit. In other words, I think it's going to become in many instances and for many roles expected and standard. Healthcare provision for either the individual and or their families, pension top up, and also discounts on local memberships. And a straightforward one to suggest here is gyms. But at all times, we need to ensure that we're mirroring the culture and values of your business. So in summary, you need to understand your employees. Listening to Gary's verbose speaking, getting involved with understanding who they are as individuals, what makes them tick, what stage of life they're at, and addressing some of those needs that we covered off in Maslow's hierarchy are absolutely critical. Ensure their needs are met and get the main engine of the business motivated and working. We can't forget key individuals and understanding their priorities. For particular SME businesses, many key individuals actually unlock succession issues and also have the benefit of driving the business on the interim periods, so absolutely critical. There are lots of loopholes that need to be navigated through, particularly on share option schemes and long-term awards. Therefore, I strongly recommend, but I'm bound to, that you get some detailed advice before implementing any share schemes. Largely concludes the presentation this morning. I hope it was of interest and some softer areas prospectively to have a look at and get touchy-feely with, but nonetheless critically important in my opinion at this particular juncture. EMI share option schemes and growth shares, please do give some thought to for longer term employees. They have the benefit of little cash requirement today, but for long-term benefit to the business. And finally, don't disregard in its entirety, albeit in my opinion less relevant at this juncture, some of the shorter term incentive schemes. Enough speaking from me at this particular juncture. Be very kind to take any questions that you may have. Alternatively, we can convene with anybody who'd like to convene afterwards to discuss any issues or queries.